Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The afternoon light fell softly through the tall windows of the Beresfords' Mayfair flat, casting long, lazy shadows across the sitting room. It was the sort of day that made one feel inclined toward idleness. A Tuesday in late September, when London seemed caught between the lingering warmth of summer and the approaching chill of autumn. Tommy Beresford lay sprawled in his favourite chair, a newspaper draped across his chest, having abandoned it some minutes earlier in favour of a gentle doze. His face, lined with the sort of good humour that comes from facing life with neither great ambition nor great fear, was peaceful in repose. Tuppence, his wife, sat at the escritoire by the window, ostensibly attending to correspondence, though in truth she was far more occupied with watching the passers-by in the street below. She had always possessed a gift for idle observation, a talent, Tommy insisted, that bordered on nosiness, though Tuppence preferred to call it cultivated curiosity. Her dark hair, arranged with that particular nonchalance that suggested both care and indifference, caught the light as she turned her head, listening to the distant rumble of traffic. "You're snoring," she announced. Without turning round, Tommy's eyes opened immediately. "I most certainly am not." "You were producing sounds that would do a rather portly pig considerable credit. Tuppence, my dear, you wound me." Tommy stretched with the contentment of a man who had nothing more pressing to do than perhaps wonder what cook was preparing for dinner. "Besides, I wasn't sleeping. I was thinking, with your mouth open. How extraordinarily advanced of you." Tommy smiled, that slow, warm smile that had first attracted her to him all those years ago. "What would I do without you to keep me honest? Remain perpetually deluded about your own shortcomings, I expect." Tuppence set down her pen and turned in her chair to face him properly. How dreadfully dull that would be for both of us. They had been married now for nearly 20 years, and the spark between them, that particular alchemy of affection, respect and genuine amusement, had never quite diminished. The adventure of their youth, when they had stumbled into detective work almost by accident, had settled into something deeper and more enduring, a kind of partnership that made even the ordinary moments feel subtly alive. "I received rather a curious letter this morning," Tuppence said, retrieving it from the pile of correspondence beside her. "From Mrs. Hartington, you remember? Eleanor Hartington. We met her at the Creighton's ball 2 seasons ago. Dreadfully elegant woman. Kept talking about her nephew's troubles." Tommy struggled to place the name. Mrs. Hartington was precisely the sort of person he met at society events. Pleasant enough, but invariably forgotten within a fortnight. Ring any bells, but not loudly. "What's she written?" Tuppence adjusted her spectacles, a gesture purely for effect, as her vision was flawless, and read aloud, "My dear Mrs. Beresford, I find myself in rather an awkward position, and I should very much like your advice. I have heard through several channels that you and your husband possess a talent for untangling the sort of delicate matters that the police might consider beneath their notice. I am hosting a small house party this weekend at Ashworth Manor, near Tunbridge Wells, and I wonder if you might find it convenient to attend as my guests. I should be most grateful for your discretion, and, if I may be frank, your particular skills of observation. Yours in hope, Eleanor Hartington." Tuppence looked up. Well, what?" I still can't quite place her. Do you never listen when I speak? Elegant woman, nephew, the Creighton's ball. She's inviting us to a house party. Tommy swung his legs down from the chair with a groan that suggested the movement required a great deal more effort than it actually did. Tuppence, we've only just recovered from the Ashworths' last dinner party. You remember, 6 courses, and that ghastly Mrs. Pennington Smythe with her endless talk of her prize dahlias. This isn't the Ashworths' house party. It's Mrs. Hartington's. She's renting Ashworth Manor for the autumn. Tuppence held up the letter with a knowing smile, and I've already sent her a reply saying we'd be delighted to attend. Tommy opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. He had learned long ago that resistance was not merely futile, it was positively counterproductive. Tuppence had a gift for knowing what he actually wanted before he'd worked it out himself. When? This Saturday, 4 days away. And what makes you think there's anything mysterious about it? Tuppence rose and walked over to him, handing him the letter. Read between the lines, Tommy. Delicate matters. Discretion. Skills of observation. This isn't a woman who's having someone to advise her on the seating arrangements. Something is afoot. Tommy read the letter carefully, then reread it. Tuppence was right, as she so often was. The phrasing was too careful, too deliberate. A woman didn't invite near strangers to a house party unless she had a compelling reason. It could be nothing. Yes, or it could be everything. Tuppence's eyes gleamed with that particular light that Tommy had come to recognize as the precursor to adventure. When have you ever known me to be wrong about these things? You were wrong about the Weatherby case, Tommy offered weakly. I was right about the Weatherby case. I was merely wrong about the motive. A subtle but important distinction. Tommy laughed and reached for her hand. Very well, Ashworth Manor, this Saturday. But Tuppence, yes? Try not to accuse anyone of murder in the first 5 minutes. Some people find it disconcerting. Tuppence gave him a look of mock innocence. I have never accused anyone of murder in the first 5 minutes. I am the very soul of discretion. That's precisely what I'm afraid of. Ashworth Manor emerged from the autumn mist like something from a Gothic novel. All red brick and ivy, with chimneys that seemed to multiply the further one looked up. It was not particularly large as country houses went, but it possessed that particular quality of old money that no amount of architectural grandeur could quite convey, a sense that it had stood in precisely this spot for centuries, and would likely continue to do so long after its current inhabitants had dissolved into memory. Mrs. Hartington greeted them in the drawing-room, a space of considerable elegance, decorated in that style that suggested someone had employed a very good London firm and then trusted them implicitly. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate series of waves, and eyes that missed very little. She wore a dress of pale blue silk that did nothing to disguise her anxiety, though her smile was warm enough. My dear Mrs. Beresford, Mr. Beresford, how delightful that you could come. I confess I wasn't entirely certain you would respond to my letter. I may have been rather too cryptic. Not at all, Tuppence assured her, taking the hand that was offered. We were intrigued, though I must confess, my husband and I are not entirely convinced we're the sort of people one engages for. Well, for whatever it is you require. Mrs. Hartington smiled, a gesture that seemed to cost her some effort. Come, I should introduce you to the other guests. They won't remain unaware of your purpose here for long, I'm afraid. At Ashworth, secrets have a way of becoming public property within hours. She led them through corridors lined with portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow their progress, and into a smaller drawing room where 3 other guests were gathered. The first was a man of perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and the sort of expression that suggested he'd recently experienced a significant disappointment and had only just begun to come to terms with it. He rose as they entered, introducing himself as Dr. Edmund Corby, recently returned from a position in colonial India. The second was a woman, striking rather than beautiful, with dark hair pulled back from a face that possessed the sort of angular refinement that came from breeding, and Tuppence suspected considerable strength of will. This was Lady Catherine Vane, widow of Lord Vane these past 5 years. The third was a young man, perhaps 25, with the restless energy of someone whose mind moved faster than his circumstances allowed. He introduced himself as Richard Hartington, Mrs. Hartington's nephew. "I expect you're wondering what you've walked into," Richard said, with a directness that his aunt seemed not to appreciate. "Mother, that is, Aunt Eleanor, won't say a word about what's actually happened. She's been frightfully mysterious about the whole thing." "Richard, please," Mrs. Hartington said, though there was no real reproof in her tone. "I'll explain everything once we're all settled." Dinner was announced, and they filed into a dining room of considerable proportions, though with an intimacy that suggested the entire house had been built for smaller gatherings than modern fashion dictated. The meal progressed through several courses with the sort of careful politeness that suggested everyone was waiting for someone else to break the ice. It was Tuppence, predictably, who did so. "Mrs. Hartington," she said, setting down her fork with the air of someone who had decided that social niceties had been observed for quite long enough. "I suspect that the reason we've been invited here isn't entirely unrelated to the extraordinary collection of very fine jewellery you're all wearing, and the curious fact that nobody seems to want to look at anyone else directly." There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Lady Catherine Vane laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She's perfectly right, Eleanor. The girl's absolutely right. We might as well tell them now." Mrs. Hartington set down her wine-glass with a trembling hand. "I have lost something rather precious, or rather, it has been taken from me. I'm not yet entirely certain which." "The pink pearl," Richard said quietly. "My God," Tommy murmured. "Not the legendary—" "One and the same," Lady Catherine interrupted. "The pink pearl of Maharaja, one of the most extraordinary pieces of jewellery in private hands. Worth, I should imagine, somewhere in the region of £50,000, though of course its true value is almost impossible to calculate." "Where did it go?" Tuppence asked. "It disappeared," Mrs. Hartington said. "3 weeks ago from my London house. I kept it in a safe in my bedroom, locked. The room was locked, and yet, when I went to check on it, I do so every few weeks, it was gone." "The police?" Tommy asked. "Inspector Meadows was most thorough," Mrs. Hartington said, "and entirely unhelpful. He concluded that either I had been robbed by a professional, in which case, he said, there was no chance of recovery, or I had misplaced it. He seemed to find the latter explanation quite appealing." "The police," Lady Catherine said with barely concealed contempt, "are invariably useless, particularly when it comes to anything that requires actual reasoning." "Yet you're all here," Tuppence observed, "at this house party, which suggests to me that this isn't merely about a missing jewel, however valuable. There's something else." Mrs. Hartington exchanged a glance with Richard. "Yes," she said quietly, "the pink pearl has appeared." "Appeared where?" Tommy leaned forward slightly. "In the possession," Mrs. Hartington said, "of someone who most certainly did not have it 3 weeks ago. Someone who claims, furthermore, that she's owned it for at least that long. And the truly remarkable thing is that she has the papers to prove it. Breakfast the following morning was a subdued affair. The 4 guests, for they had learned, over the course of an extended conversation that had stretched well into the previous evening, that the 5th member of the house party would not be arriving until late Saturday, sat around a table laden with eggs, kippers and toast, each engaged in their own private thoughts. Tuppence had risen early, driven by a curiosity that sleep could not entirely suppress. Tommy, less eager to disturb his breakfast, had remained in their bedroom, reading the morning papers with the sort of careful attention usually reserved for important documents. "She's called Mrs. Sinclair," Richard was saying, addressing Tuppence in a low voice. "She's a widow. Husband died about 2 years ago. She inherited the pearl, she claims, from an aunt, a woman called Margot Ashworth." "Ashworth?" Tuppence's eyebrows rose. "This house? No relation as far as anyone knows. But the point is, she has letters from this aunt, dated back 6 years, referring to the pearl. And she has a letter from the aunt's solicitors, written shortly before the aunt's death, confirming that the pearl was left to her. So either your aunt is lying," Tuppence said, "or Mrs. Sinclair is." "Or someone is lying," Richard corrected, "and neither of them knows it." The door opened, and Tommy entered, newspaper under his arm. He was followed almost immediately by Dr. Corby, whose early morning walk had apparently done nothing to improve his disposition. He took his seat with a grunt that might have been greeting, or might have been commentary on the state of the marmalade. "I had a look at Mrs. Sinclair's house last night," he said abruptly. "She lives about 3 miles from here, near the village. Charming place. Considerably better maintained than most country cottages, which suggests either a tidy disposition or money to pay for someone else's tidiness." "You investigated her?" Tommy asked, surprised. "I did. My apologies if I overstepped, but I've learned over my years in India that the key to understanding any situation is understanding the person at its centre. Mrs. Sinclair is not what she pretends to be." "What do you mean?" Tuppence asked sharply. "I mean," Dr. Corby said, "that I recognized her. I haven't seen her in 25 years, and she's changed considerably, but I recognized her nonetheless. Her name isn't Sinclair. It was, well, I think she was calling herself Gertrude Ashcroft when I knew her. She was involved in some rather dubious dealings in Delhi. Insurance fraud, if I recall correctly, though the case never went to trial." The silence that followed was absolute. "Are you certain?" Lady Catherine asked. "Reasonably certain. I could have been mistaken, but I don't think I was. There are certain faces one doesn't forget." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a glance. This, then, was the shape of it. Not merely a theft, but something more complex. A woman with a dubious past claiming possession of a valuable jewel, armed with documents that appeared to support her claim. "We should visit her," Tuppence said. "Mrs. Sinclair, I mean. We should see this pearl for ourselves." "That's precisely what I was going to suggest," Richard said, "though Aunt Eleanor will fret about it. She's convinced that any direct confrontation will result in the pearl being spirited away." "The pearl," Tommy said thoughtfully, "would have to be smuggled past quite a significant amount of scrutiny if it were to leave the district. Someone would have noticed. A woman selling jewels of that value doesn't go unnoticed." "Unless she's already sold it," Dr. Corby pointed out, "to a private buyer. There's a considerable market for that sort of thing, among people who don't ask too many questions about provenance." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hartington, who looked as though she had slept very little. She was followed by Lady Catherine, whose composure was as flawless as ever. I have arranged, Mrs. Hartington said, for Mrs. Sinclair to call here this afternoon. I thought it best to face the matter directly. She's agreed to bring the pearl with her, so that we might examine the documentation together. And if she refuses to come, Tommy asked, then I think we must assume the worst. Mrs. Sinclair arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, on an afternoon that had turned grey and rather threatening, as though the weather itself was in sympathy with the occasion. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with dark hair only just beginning to grey at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome once, though something had hollowed it out, leaving only the architecture behind. She wore a dress of dark green that was fashionable without being ostentatious, and an emerald brooch that glittered like ice. She did not bring the pearl, I'm afraid, she said, with a smile that suggested she was not afraid at all. That I've left it at my bank in the village. One never carries such things about, you understand. Not when there are so many unscrupulous people about. How convenient, Tuppence observed. Mrs. Sinclair turned to her with an expression of mild interest. And you are? Mrs. Beresford. My husband and I are guests of Mrs. Hartington. We have some small experience with matters involving valuable items. How charming. Mrs. Sinclair's eyes, a peculiar shade of grey-green, flicked from Tuppence to Tommy and back again. In that moment, something passed across her face. Not quite fear, but something akin to it. Recognition, perhaps, or the memory of recognition. The documentation? Mrs. Hartington asked, her voice strained. Mrs. Sinclair produced a leather portfolio from her bag. The letters it contained were on proper letterhead, dated appropriately, and signed with a careful hand that suggested someone who had taken considerable pains to make them authentic. The solicitor's letter was particularly persuasive, formal, precise, exactly the sort of thing a proper solicitor would write. These are remarkably thorough, Tommy said, examining them carefully. I take care of my affairs, Mrs. Sinclair replied. I'm sure you understand. Have you any objection to us making inquiries? He asked, simply to establish the matter conclusively. No reflection on your honesty, you understand. Merely a formality. Mrs. Sinclair's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I would prefer that the matter be settled without further investigation. The pearl is mine. I have documentation. If Mrs. Hartington wishes to pursue the matter further, I suggest she contact her solicitors and mine, and we might resolve it through the proper channels. How very sensible, Tuppence said, though I wonder, Mrs. Sinclair, whether you've given any thought to the possibility that someone may have gone to considerable trouble to create a history for this pearl that never actually existed. That these documents, however authentic they appear, might be the work of an extremely skilled forger. Mrs. Sinclair rose. I don't appreciate the implication, Mrs. Beresford. No, Tuppence agreed. I suspect you wouldn't. That will be all. Then, after Mrs. Sinclair had departed, with considerably less grace than she had arrived, the drawing-room fell into a heavy silence. The documents are forgeries, Dr. Corby said quietly. Exceptionally good ones, Tommy agreed. But yes, the peculiarity of the solicitor's language, the specific wording of the inheritance clause. It's far too modern, too formal in a way that wasn't in fashion even 10 years ago. And there's something else. What? Richard asked eagerly. The signature on the solicitor's letter, Tommy said. It's from Weatherby and Sons. They're a London firm. But according to my recollection, Weatherby and Sons dissolved partnership in 1910. A firm by that name couldn't have existed 5 years ago. So the pearl, Lady Catherine said slowly, was stolen by your aunt, Mrs. Hartington. And this woman, this Sinclair or Ashcroft, or whatever her name is, has somehow acquired knowledge of the theft, and is now attempting to blackmail you by claiming she owns it legitimately." "I don't think so," Tuppence said. She had moved to the window and was gazing out toward the gardens, where the first drops of rain had begun to fall. "I think it's rather more complicated than that. I think the theft was real, but the person who stole it isn't Mrs. Sinclair. And I think Mrs. Sinclair knows something about the theft, or the pearl, that she's not telling us. Then we need to find out what happened to it," Tommy said. "Between the moment it was taken from Mrs. Hartington's safe and the moment Mrs. Sinclair began claiming she owned it, there must be someone who saw something, someone who knows. I may be able to help with that," Dr. Corby said. He withdrew a telegram from his pocket, which had apparently arrived while they were with Mrs. Sinclair. "I sent inquiries to my contacts in Delhi yesterday. I've just received confirmation that a woman matching the description of Gertrude Ashcroft left India rather hurriedly, about 3 months ago, under a cloud of what my contact delicately describes as unfortunate circumstances. She appears to have come to England almost immediately." 3 months ago, Richard said, just before the pearl disappeared. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like a warning. That evening, after dinner, they arranged themselves in Mrs. Hartington's sitting room with the air of people engaged in something that was part conference, part séance. A fire burned in the hearth, casting shadows that danced and flickered with the sort of movement that suggested hidden life. Tuppence had drawn her chair close to Tommy's, and their conversation, conducted in low voices while the others attended to their own thoughts, had the quality of intimacy that only comes from years of shared purpose. "The forged documents are key," Tommy was saying. "Someone went to considerable effort to create a history for that pearl. The question is whether it was Mrs. Sinclair or someone else." "Someone else, I should think," Tuppence murmured. "Mrs. Sinclair didn't impress me as being particularly clever. Cunning, yes. Desperate, possibly. But not clever enough to forge documents good enough to fool you at a glance. She would have needed help. And that help," Tommy continued, "would have come from someone with knowledge of legal documents and the skill to replicate them. Not just any forger, but someone with actual experience in producing the real thing." They were interrupted by Richard, who had been pacing the room like a caged animal. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the timing. The pearl disappears from Aunt Eleanor's house in London 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Sinclair appears in the district, claiming to own it. Why would she wait a week? Why not come forward immediately? Because, Lady Catherine said, joining them by the fire, she needed that week to establish herself, to create a history, to make inquiries, to ensure that when she appeared, she was sufficiently local that people wouldn't suspect where she'd actually come from." "But that's the question, isn't it?" Tuppence said. "Where did she come from? She didn't simply arrive from Delhi fully formed with property and a history and legal documents. Someone brought her here. Someone set her up, established her, and provided her with the means to make her claim." "An accomplice," Tommy said. "More than that," Tuppence continued. "A partner, someone who had access to the pearl, or knowledge of how to gain access to it, and who decided to work with Mrs. Sinclair to what? To steal it? But from whom? The theft itself is confusing. Mrs. Hartington's safe was locked. The room was locked, and yet someone got in and took the pearl. That requires either expertise or help from someone who had legitimate access. It was Dr. Corby who answered her. I may have an explanation for that, he said. He had been examining a small notebook, which he now held aloft. I made some inquiries in the village this afternoon. Discreetly, you understand. According to the local gossip, which is, as usual, the most reliable source of information, a man was seen at Mrs. Hartington's London house approximately 3 weeks ago. He claimed to be a surveyor, making an assessment of the property for insurance purposes. He was let in by the housekeeper and spent several hours examining the house. He was never seen again, and nobody thought this unusual. Richard asked, "My dear boy, a surveyor is as common as dust. Nobody pays them the slightest attention." But according to the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Porter, whom I spoke to on the telephone, the man was extremely interested in the bedrooms, in particular in the location of the windows and the structure of the walls. Rather more interested, she thought, than a surveyor ought to be. "A thief," Tommy said, "casing the house, learning the layout so that he or someone else could return and steal the pearl. But then he didn't return alone," Tuppence said. "Someone else went to the house, someone with access, someone the servants knew or trusted." "The housekeeper," Lady Catherine suggested. "She might have been complicit. Or," Tuppence said slowly, "the thief never left the house at all. Suppose the surveyor never actually departed. Suppose he remained hidden, waited until night fell, made his way to Mrs. Hartington's bedroom and took the pearl. Then, in the morning, he walked out as though nothing had happened." "But the housekeeper would have seen him," Richard protested. "Would she?" Tuppence rose and began to pace, her mind visibly working through the problem. A man, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase. Early in the morning, the servants are all occupied. He puts on his hat, walks down the stairs, and leaves. Who would stop him? Who would even notice? "It's plausible," Tommy admitted, "but there's still the question of the accomplice. The forged documents suggest help from someone local, someone with legal knowledge or connections to a forger. We need to know more about Mrs. Hartington's household," Dr. Corby said. "The housekeeper, the servants, anyone who had access to the bedroom. And we need to know more about Mrs. Sinclair," Tuppence added, "where she's actually come from, how she came into contact with Mrs. Hartington, how she knew about the pearl in the first place." It was at that moment that a knock came at the door. Before anyone could respond, it opened, and one of the servants entered. A young woman with an anxious expression that suggested she had been sent on an unwelcome errand. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Hartington," she said, "but there's been a telephone call from the village. From the police? There's been an accident. A woman matching the description of Mrs. Sinclair has been hit by a motor car near the bridge. She's been taken to the hospital in Tunbridge Wells." The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, as though the air itself had become suddenly charged. "Is she?" Mrs. Hartington began. "Alive," the servant said, "but only just according to the police. Inspector Meadows would like someone to come and give a formal statement as to her identity and circumstances." After the servant had departed, nobody moved. The fire crackled and spat, and the rain continued its assault on the windows. "An accident," Lady Catherine said quietly. "How perfectly timed." "You don't believe it was an accident," Tuppence said. "It was not a question, do you?" Tuppence looked at Tommy, whose face had taken on that particular expression of grim determination that she had come to know over their years together. "No," she said, "I don't. Someone doesn't want us to speak to Mrs. Sinclair. Someone doesn't want her to reveal what she knows." "Then we had better hope she survives," Tommy said, "because if she doesn't, we've just lost our only real link to whoever orchestrated this entire affair." The drive to Tunbridge Wells was conducted in near total silence, broken only by the rhythmic percussion of the rain against the motorcar's roof. Tommy drove, his jaw set, while Tuppence stared out the window with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something beyond the grey English countryside. They had left Richard behind with Mrs. Hartington and Dr. Corby, with instructions to make discreet inquiries about the accident's circumstances. Mrs. Sinclair lay in the hospital bed like a figure carved from alabaster, her dark hair spread against the white pillow, her breathing shallow and laboured. A bandage wrapped her head, and her left leg, elevated on pillows, was heavily plastered. The doctor, a tired-looking man of perhaps 50, informed them that she was unlikely to regain consciousness for several hours, if at all. "The motor car," Tommy asked. "Did the driver stop?" "Fled the scene," the doctor said. "According to the witnesses. Rather hit and run, I'm afraid. The police are investigating. Inspector Meadows, a solid man with a methodical approach to his work that suggested either extraordinary thoroughness or extraordinary slowness, met them in a small anteroom off the ward. He listened to their account of Mrs. Sinclair, or rather, of the woman they knew as Mrs. Sinclair, with the sort of attention usually reserved for matters of considerably greater import. "So, she's not who she claims to be," Meadows said. When they had finished. "We don't know who she claims to be," Tommy corrected gently. "We know who she's been claiming to be in this district, but her real name, her real history, remains uncertain." "Difficult, that," Meadows said, making a note. "Identification, you see. Without knowing who she actually is, it's rather hard to determine whether this was a deliberate attempt on her life or merely misfortune." "It was deliberate," Tuppence said flatly. "Someone attempted to kill her." Meadows looked at her with an expression of patient sympathy. "Mrs. Beresford, I understand your concern, but these things are rarely as dramatic as people wish them to be. A woman is struck by a motor car in failing light on a wet road. The driver panics and flees. It's careless, certainly, callous even, but not necessarily premeditated murder." Tuppence opened her mouth to argue, but Tommy placed a restraining hand on her knee. "Thank you, Inspector," he said. "I expect you'll let us know if she regains consciousness." "Of course. If she does, we'll need a formal statement regarding her actual identity and the circumstances that brought her to our district." They drove back to Ashworth Manor in the gathering darkness, each lost in thought. The rain had eased, and the stars were beginning to emerge, pinprick holes in the fabric of night that suggested the universe beyond our small, troubled corner of it. "She was meant to talk to us," Tuppence said suddenly. "Mrs. Sinclair, or whatever her name is. Whoever hit her intended to ensure she never got the chance." "Almost certainly," Tommy agreed. "But why would she talk to us? She didn't know us. She had no reason to trust us." "Unless," Tuppence said slowly, "she already knew who was behind all of this, unless she realized at some point this afternoon that she'd made a mistake, that she'd gotten mixed up with something or someone far more dangerous than she'd anticipated." They had pulled up the drive to Ashworth Manor now, and Tommy killed the engine. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Tuppence said, "about the documents. The forged documents were very good. Too good, almost. They weren't the work of someone hurriedly creating a false history. They were the work of someone who had access to the real thing, to real legal documents, to real forms and letterhead. Someone who knew exactly how to replicate them." "A solicitor," Tommy said. "Or someone who worked for one," Tuppence continued. "Someone with access to their files, their materials, their knowledge. Someone who knew how to create documents so authentic that even you couldn't immediately detect that they were forgeries." They sat in the motor car, listening to the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. "There's something else," Tuppence said. "Something about Mrs. Sinclair that struck me. When Dr. Corby mentioned recognizing her from Delhi, her face changed, but not in the way you'd expect if she were merely embarrassed at being exposed. It was fear, pure, absolute fear, as though she'd just realized that the past she thought she'd escaped had caught up with her. "What do you think happened in Delhi?" Tommy asked. "I think Dr. Corby was right, that she was involved in insurance fraud. But I think there was more to it than that. I think she was working with someone who got caught and left her to take the blame. Someone she was trying to find, to confront, to punish. And then, by some extraordinary chance or design, she found him, here, in England. And that someone," Tommy said slowly, "is the person who forged the documents and set her up with the false claim to the pearl." "Precisely." They sat in silence for a moment longer. "We'll need to examine this from another angle," Tommy said finally. "We need to know who forged those documents. We need to know who has the skill and the access to do something like that." "There's a solicitor in the village," Tuppence said. "Weatherby and Sons were dissolved in 1910, you said, but the letter was dated using that name. Someone locally must have access to information about how that firm operated. Someone must know about the signature and the form and all the rest of it. A solicitor's clerk, perhaps, or an assistant. Someone who worked at a time when that firm was still operating." "There's only one way to find out," Tommy said, reaching for the ignition. "We ask the offices of Bartholomew and Finch, solicitors, occupied a grey stone building on the high street of Tunbridge Wells, exactly the sort of place where English legal matters had been conducted for the past 100 years or more. The senior partner, a man named Finch, the Bartholomew, having departed this life in 1895, received them with the sort of courtesy that suggested he found unexpected visitors mildly, troublesome but socially obligatory. Weatherby and Sons, he said, when Tuppence broached the subject, his eyebrows rising slightly. That's a firm I haven't heard referenced in quite some years. They dissolved, if memory serves, around the time I was just beginning my articles. Why do you ask? We're investigating a matter involving forged documents, Tommy said carefully. Documents that purport to be from Weatherby and Sons. We're trying to establish whether such forgeries would be detectable to someone familiar with the firm's practices and procedures. Finch's expression shifted from mild curiosity to considerably greater interest. Forged documents? You should certainly have reported this to the police. We're still in the preliminary stages of investigation, Tuppence said smoothly. We would prefer to establish a few facts before involving Inspector Meadows. Finch seemed to wrestle with this for a moment, then apparently decided that discretion was called for. He rose and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office, from which he withdrew a yellowed ledger. Weatherby and Sons employed a clerk named Nathaniel Gray, he said, running his finger down a page, or rather, a series of clerks, as was common. But there was one particular clerk, Gray, the name was, who worked for them for nearly 20 years. He was renowned for his attention to detail, his understanding of the technical aspects of legal documentation. A remarkable man by all accounts. Pedantic, perhaps, but in a profession where precision is essential, that's hardly a fault. What became of him? Tommy asked. He left the firm in 1909, shortly before they dissolved. I believe he took up a private practice, handling minor legal matters for local clients, that sort of thing. Nothing grand. I lost track of him years ago. He would be quite elderly now if he's still alive at all. Do you know where he settled? Tuppence asked. After leaving Weatherby and Sons, Finch consulted the ledger once more. There's an address here, Rosewood Cottage on the edge of the village, though I can't imagine he's still there. That was more than 40 years ago. They departed the solicitor's office with the address carefully noted, and Tommy drove them directly to the cottage in question. It was a small place, set back from the road behind a fence that had seen better years. The garden was overgrown, and the windows were dark, suggesting an absence of occupants. "Empty," Tuppence said. "Disappointed. Or someone is pretending it is," Tommy replied. It was at that moment that they became aware of a motor car that had, they now realized, been following them since they left Tunbridge Wells. It maintained a careful distance, never quite close enough to be threatening, but near enough that its presence became impossible to ignore. When Tommy slowed, the motor car slowed. When he turned a corner, it followed. "We're being followed," Tuppence said quietly, without turning her head. "So I notice," Tommy replied. "Shall we see where they take us?" He accelerated slightly, taking a series of turns that led them deeper into the countryside. The pursuing motor car remained steadfast, never gaining on them, never falling back. It was a game, though not one that was particularly enjoyable, and Tommy found himself growing increasingly tense as the landscape became progressively more remote. It was Tuppence who first noticed the envelope, slipped under the windscreen wipers that had somehow appeared whilst they were in Finch's office. She retrieved it as Tommy pulled the motor car over, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in large, uneven handwriting. "Stop asking questions," she read aloud. "You are playing with things far more dangerous than you understand. Leave the matter of the pearl to those equipped to handle it. This is your only warning. Ignore it, and there will be consequences." Tommy took the note from her hand, his jaw tightening. "It's getting serious." "It was already serious," Tuppence said. "Someone attempted to kill Mrs. Sinclair. They didn't do that out of mere irritation at being investigated." "No," Tommy agreed. "They did it because they're desperate. They did it because they're afraid of what she might say." Behind them, the pursuing motor car had stopped as well, maintaining its distance. Tommy watched it in the mirror. "We need to go back," Tuppence said. "We need to tell the others. We need to go to the police." "Not yet," Tommy said. His mind was working through the puzzle, trying to arrange the pieces into a coherent picture. "Not until we've spoken to Nathaniel Gray. If he's still alive, if he's still in this district, then he's the key to all of this. He's the only person who could have forged those documents with such expertise. He's the only person who would have the knowledge. And the only person," Tuppence said quietly, "who would have motive." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Tuppence said, "that the person sending these warnings, the person who attempted to kill Mrs. Sinclair, knows that we're getting close, knows that we're about to discover something that will bring the whole house of cards down. If Nathaniel Gray was involved in forging the documents, then someone else is involved in the theft. Someone else is involved in the attempt on Mrs. Sinclair's life. Someone desperate enough to kill to keep their secret." The drive back to Ashworth Manor was conducted in a state of heightened anxiety, with one eye constantly on the mirror, watching the pursuing motor car maintain its patient distance. When they finally pulled through the gates of the manor, the other vehicle did not follow. Instead, it simply stopped, parked on the verge of the road, its driver silhouetted against the grey landscape, watching as Tommy and Tuppence disappeared from view. The storm broke that night with a violence that seemed to mirror the tension that had settled over Ashworth Manor, like a physical presence. Thunder rumbled across the sky, and lightning split the darkness into stark, sudden moments of illumination. The rain came down in sheets, and the windows rattled with the force of the wind. It was in this atmosphere that Richard, having made careful inquiries in the village, brought them the final piece of the puzzle. Nathaniel Gray. he said, seated by the fire with a cup of coffee that steamed gently in the overheated room, is very much alive. He's 83 years old, and he lives in a cottage on the edge of the village. Nobody sees him much. He's become a bit of a recluse. But according to the people I spoke to, he had a visitor about 3 months ago, a woman who asked to speak to him privately. A woman? Tuppence asked sharply. That's what the landlord at the pub said. He noticed her leaving Gray's cottage just before evening. He said she was dark-haired, perhaps 50 years old, and looked rather distressed. He thought it was his secretary, or something similar. But then he remembered that Gray didn't have a secretary anymore. Hadn't for years, Mrs. Sinclair, Tommy said. Almost certainly, Richard confirmed. The description matches. And the timing 3 months ago, that's when Mrs. Sinclair first appeared in the district, isn't it? What was their connection? Lady Catherine asked. She had been listening from her chair by the window, her eyes reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. How did Mrs. Sinclair, or Gertrude Ashcroft, or whoever she actually is, come to know Nathaniel Gray? That, Dr. Corby said thoughtfully, is the question that has been troubling me. I've been examining the timeline. Gray worked at Weatherby and Sons. The firm dissolved in 1910. But I've been thinking about what might have happened during that dissolution. What if something else occurred? What if Gray's departure wasn't voluntary? You think he was dismissed? Tuppence asked. I think more than that, Dr. Corby continued. I think he was involved in something that caused the firm to close abruptly. And I think that whatever it was, it involved someone who was also connected to Mrs. Sinclair in Delhi. Someone who knew about Weatherby and Sons and knew about Gray's expertise with legal documents. An accomplice from the old days, Tommy said slowly. Someone who worked with Gray, who then left England, who then, 20 years later, came back and looked him up. And asked him to do something illegal, Tuppence finished, to forge documents, to create a false history for a pearl. The lightning flashed again, and in that moment they heard the sound of a motor car arriving at the manor. Before anyone could move, there was a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of a struggle. They rushed from the sitting room to find Inspector Meadows, confronting a dishevelled elderly man who was attempting, with admirable but ultimately futile determination, to reach the stairs. Nathaniel Gray, Meadows announced, has been in a motor car accident. He claims to have been deliberately run off the road, and he's requested to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Beresford immediately. Gray was led into the drawing room, where the warmth of the fire seemed to draw all the strength from his limbs. He collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily, his ancient face grey with shock. A cut on his forehead bled gently, and his hands shook with more than the simple effects of age. "They tried to kill me," he said, his voice thin and wavering, "just as they tried to kill her. I know they did. Who are they?" Tommy asked gently. "And who did they try to kill?" "The woman," Gray said, "the one from Delhi. She came to me 3 months ago, asking me to create documents. She said it was for an insurance claim that had been wrongly denied. She said she needed proof of ownership of a valuable piece of jewelry. She offered me money, a great deal of money. I should have refused. I knew it was wrong. But I'm old, you see. The pension from the firm was never much, and my savings have dwindled. I needed the money." "So you forged the documents?" Tuppence said. "I did," Gray admitted. "And I did them well. I have a gift for such things. I created letters from her aunt, letters that established a history of ownership. I created documents from Weatherby and Sons. I still had access to some old forms, you see, filed away all these years. Nobody had asked for them. I created everything she needed, and in return, she paid me £500, Gray said. A fortune to a man in my position. But that's not the end of it. 2 days ago, a man came to see me. A man I hadn't seen in more than 40 years. A man named Harrington. James Harrington. The name hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. Mrs. Hartington made a small sound. Not quite a gasp, but something close to it. "My husband," she said quietly. "My late husband was named James, but he died 7 years ago." "Then someone is using his name," Gray continued. "This man told me that if I wanted to stay alive, I needed to stop talking about the documents. He said that if I revealed anything to anyone, he would ensure that I met with an accident. A serious one. He seemed to find the irony amusing. An old man having an accident. No one would think it unusual. And then, Tommy prompted. And then, this evening, I was driving home from the village, and a motor car came out of nowhere, forced me off the road. I managed to drive into the ditch, and I got out and ran. The driver didn't follow, but I knew he was coming back, so I made my way here. I remembered that the woman, Mrs. Sinclair, had mentioned this house. I remembered she said she was going to claim to own the pearl, that she was going to present it as her own. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I do. It was all part of the plan." "What plan?" Mrs. Hartington asked, her voice barely audible. Gray looked at her with something akin to pity. "The plan to steal your pearl, madam, and to make it appear as though you were losing your mind, that you were mistaken about your own possessions, that perhaps you'd never owned it at all, that perhaps someone had convinced you that you had." Inspector Meadows, who had been listening to this exposition with an expression of growing discomfort, stepped forward. "I'm going to need a great deal more information," he said, "starting with this man who claims to be James Harrington. Where is he now?" "I don't know," Gray admitted, "but I know who he is. His real name is Robert Sinclair. He was Mrs. Sinclair's husband, except that Mrs. Sinclair is not actually his wife. She's his cousin, or she was. They were involved in a scheme in Delhi nearly 25 years ago. They were trying to obtain insurance money on a jewel that didn't exist. They almost succeeded, but your inspector here—" Gray gestured vaguely at Meadows. "His predecessor became suspicious. The scheme fell apart. Sinclair disappeared to England. Miss Ashcroft, Mrs. Sinclair now, I suppose, remained in Delhi. They didn't see each other again until she came looking for him 3 months ago. She'd heard that he was here, living under an assumed name, having reinvented himself entirely. And she came to blackmail him," Tuppence said slowly. "Worse," Gray said. "She came because he'd sent for her. He had a plan. He wanted to steal your pearl, and he wanted to use her to do it. He wanted to create a situation where she could claim to own it legitimately. And when that was established, he could arrange for her to have an accident, a fatal one. He would inherit her estate, which would include the pearl, and then he could sell it and disappear again." "But why?" Mrs. Hartington asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why target me?" "Because," Gray said, "he married you under a false name, and he's been waiting for years for the opportunity to enact his revenge. You were the daughter of the man who ran him out of Delhi, the man who made him a fugitive. He became your husband so he could destroy you. This pearl, this theft, it was just the final humiliation. You would be left with nothing. No jewels, no reputation, no dignity. And he would have everything." The storm had eased by midnight, retreating to the far edges of the sky, where it grumbled and complained like a disappointed guest. The inhabitants of Ashworth Manor, however, showed no signs of sleep. Instead, they had gathered once more in the drawing-room, where Tommy stood before them with the air of a man about to deliver an uncomfortable truth. "Let me recapitulate what we know," he began, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace. "Mrs. Hartington received a letter 3 weeks ago from Mrs. Eleanor Hartington, inviting us to a house party. This letter explicitly asked for our assistance in a delicate matter. At first, I confess, I was uncertain what that matter was, but it became clear when we arrived. The pink pearl, a priceless piece of jewellery, had disappeared from Mrs. Hartington's safe in London, without any signs of forced entry or disturbance. The theft itself, he continued, was accomplished by a man who entered the house posing as a surveyor. He was admitted by the housekeeper without suspicion. A clever move, as servants rarely question tradespeople or professionals. He spent several hours learning the layout of the house, paying particular attention to Mrs. Hartington's bedroom. He then remained in the house, hiding until nightfall, at which point he entered the bedroom and took the pearl from the safe. In the morning, he left the house, and no one has seen him since. Precisely who was this man? Lady Catherine asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. That is the question that troubled us until this evening, Tommy said. The man who performed the theft was not the man who orchestrated it. The thief was a hired professional, someone known to the criminal underworld, someone who could be relied upon to perform his task without question and without conscience. But he was working for someone else, someone with a personal motive for revenge. Tommy paused, letting the weight of this sink in. The man we know as James Hartington, Mrs. Hartington's late husband, was not her husband at all. His real name is Robert Sinclair. 40 years ago, he and a cousin named Gertrude Ashcroft attempted to perpetrate an insurance fraud in Delhi, involving a valuable jewel and a scheme that was far too complex to detail here. They were exposed and caught, thanks to the efforts of a retired military officer, a man named Colonel Edward Hartington, Eleanor's father. Sinclair was forced to flee India. Ashcroft remained behind and was eventually acquitted. But Sinclair did not forget, Tuppence said, taking up the narrative as Tommy had taught her, falling into the rhythm of reveal that was almost choreographed between them. He came to England, changed his name, built a new life, and years later, when he discovered that Colonel Hartington had a daughter, a young woman of considerable means, he began a deliberate campaign to seduce her, to marry her, and to make her his wife. For 20 years, he lived as the devoted husband, waiting for his opportunity to extract his revenge. He knew, Tommy continued, that Eleanor's pride and her reputation meant everything to her. He knew that if the truth came out, that her husband was a criminal, that he had built their marriage on deception, it would destroy her. But that alone was not sufficient for his purposes. He wanted to humiliate her further. He wanted to strip her of her possessions, her security, her sense of reality. So he hired someone to steal the pearl, Richard said, understanding beginning to dawn. But why? What did he intend? At that moment, Tuppence said, we were supposed to receive the visit from Mrs. Sinclair, or rather, Gertrude Ashcroft, who had recently arrived from Delhi. She was going to claim ownership of the pearl, presenting forged documents that would prove her right to it. The documents were created by a man named Nathaniel Gray, who still possessed the expertise to forge official papers from Weatherby and Sons, a firm that had long since dissolved. Gray was paid to do the work, promised that it was merely for a spurious insurance claim. And Eleanor, Lady Catherine said slowly, would have been left in an impossible position, with a woman claiming to own her most precious possession, backed by what appeared to be legitimate documentation, while she had no proof of her own ownership, having had the pearls stolen from her locked safe. Worse than that, Tommy said. Robert Sinclair would have managed the situation with considerable sympathy and concern. He would have suggested that perhaps Eleanor had been confused about the pearl's history. Perhaps she'd been mistaken about acquiring it. Perhaps the stress of the situation was affecting her judgment, and by the time he was finished, the doubt in Eleanor's mind would be matched only by the doubt in the minds of all who knew her. She would be left isolated, humiliated, and wealthy only in name. Her reputation destroyed, her possessions suspect, her grip on reality questioned. But then, Mrs. Hartington said quietly, "My husband died 7 years ago, and I've been a widow ever since, leaving Sinclair's plans in disarray," Tommy confirmed, because his final revenge, his grand humiliation, was meant to be performed while Eleanor was still his wife. It was meant to destroy her while he was still by her side, seemingly her protector and confidant. With his death, he lost his chance. But he didn't accept that, Tuppence said. He couldn't accept it. So when Gertrude Ashcroft came looking for him 3 months ago, she'd been searching for him for years, intending to blackmail him over their past. He saw an opportunity. He saw a way to salvage his grand revenge. He couldn't marry Eleanor again, Tommy said, but he could still destroy her. He could hire a professional thief to steal the pearl. He could have Ashcroft create false documents claiming ownership. And when Ashcroft presented those documents, Eleanor would be in the position of not being able to prove she owned the pearl. She would be left with nothing but her word, and her reputation would be destroyed once more. This time, even more completely, because she would appear to be not merely confused, but actively dishonest. And then, Richard pressed, and then, Tuppence said quietly, Ashcroft would have an accident. A terrible accident, arranged by Sinclair's hired professional. She would be dead, and the matter would appear to be settled. Sinclair would inherit her estate, including eventually the pearl, as the only surviving family member. He would sell it and disappear once more, this time with Eleanor's reputation in tatters and her dignity destroyed. Except, Lady Catherine said, that we arrived. Exactly, Tommy confirmed. Our presence changed the calculation. Instead of Eleanor being left with only her word and her damaged reputation, she had investigators, competent investigators. And as soon as Sinclair realized that we were asking the right questions, he had to act. He arranged for Ashcroft to be hit by a motor car, attempting to silence her before she could reveal anything. And when that failed, when Gray came forward of his own volition, Sinclair had to flee. Where is he now? Mrs. Hartington asked. Inspector Meadows is searching for him, Tommy said. But I suspect he's already gone. He's had experience fleeing. He'll have planned an escape route, secured funds, arranged false papers. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. The question now is not where he is, but whether Eleanor can move forward, knowing that the man she loved was never real, that the husband who shared her bed for 20 years was a criminal motivated by revenge. The room fell silent. Outside, the last of the storm rumbled away into the distance, and the stars began to emerge once more. It was not, in fact, Inspector Meadows who found Robert Sinclair, but rather a combination of luck, determination, and the sort of intuition that Tuppence possessed in abundance. Acting on a hunch, she had requested that the hotel registers in Tunbridge Wells be checked for recent arrivals, using the names that Sinclair was known to have used in the past. A hotel clerk, motivated by the promise of a modest reward, discovered that a man named James Hartley had taken a room 3 days previously and paid for a week in advance, though he had not been seen since the previous evening. The hotel in question was a modest establishment near the railway station, the sort of place where people checked in with minimal fuss and were rarely seen to check out. Tommy and Tuppence arrived there just as dusk was beginning to fall, accompanied by Inspector Meadows and a constable. Room 14, the desk clerk said nervously. 3rd floor. I haven't seen him since yesterday morning. I assumed he was resting. The walk up the narrow stairs felt, to Tuppence, like walking towards something inevitable. The carpet was worn, and the walls bore the marks of countless previous guests. Room 14 was at the end of a corridor, and when they knocked, there was no answer. "Open it," Meadows instructed the constable, who produced a key and entered with the sort of caution that suggested he expected violence. What they found was not violence, but despair. Robert Sinclair lay on the bed, fully clothed, an empty bottle of pills on the bedside table beside him. His face was peaceful, almost serene, and it took a moment for anyone to realize that he was not merely sleeping. He was quite definitely and irrevocably dead. "When?" Tuppence asked. "Last night, I should think," the constable said, examining the body without particular concern. "He's quite cold." Inspector Meadows stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said finally, "that rather settles matters, doesn't it? The guilty party has accepted responsibility and removed himself from consideration." "He didn't accept responsibility," Tuppence said quietly. "He accepted defeat. There's rather a difference." That night, back at Ashworth Manor, they gathered once more in the drawing-room. Mrs. Hartington sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression that particular combination of relief and devastation that comes from discovering a fundamental truth about the man one has loved. "I keep thinking," she said finally, "about the early days of our marriage. How charming he was, how attentive, how he seemed to hang on my every word. Now I understand that he was studying me, learning me, preparing me for the great humiliation he had planned." "The humiliation that never came," Tommy said gently, "because he died first, because his plans were thwarted." "But the intention was always there," Mrs. Hartington continued. "Every kind gesture, every moment of affection, all of it was part of a performance. All of it was designed to make the final betrayal more complete." "There are always moments that are real," Tuppence said quietly. "I found that to be true, even in the darkest situations. There are always moments when the mask slips, when the person beneath is revealed. Perhaps he did care for you in his own way. Perhaps the revenge mattered less, as the years went on, than the life he was actually living. Or perhaps," Lady Catherine said, "he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man so twisted by past wrongs that he could not imagine life without revenge." They never would know. Robert Sinclair had taken his secrets with him, and the only person who might have provided answers, Gertrude Ashcroft, remained unconscious in the hospital, her injuries severe enough that doctors were not optimistic about her recovery. But the pearl, at least, was recovered. Among Sinclair's possessions, they found documentation suggesting that he had arranged for it to be hidden in a bank vault in London, where it had been all along, waiting to be sold once Ashcroft had successfully claimed ownership and then met with her convenient accident. It had never left England at all. It had simply been moved from one safe place to another, part of an elaborate scheme that had now, finally, come to an end. A week later, Tommy and Tuppence sat in their favourite cafe in Mayfair, the sort of establishment that had been serving tea and small cakes to the same clientele for the past 50 years. The autumn sun fell softly through the windows, and the street outside was pleasantly busy with the ordinary commerce of London life. "You were magnificent," Tuppence was saying, stirring her tea with considerable vigour. "The way you laid out the entire scheme piece by piece in the drawing-room. Very Sherlock Holmes. Very authoritative." "I had an excellent partner," Tommy replied, "who provided all the crucial insights while pretending merely to observe." "I did nothing of the sort. I was brilliantly obvious in my deductions. You were, Tommy agreed. That's what made them so effective. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the world go by. Do you ever think about it? Tuppence asked suddenly, about what would have happened if we'd never gone to that house party, if Mrs. Hartington had never sent that letter. Constantly, Tommy admitted. Eleanor would be destroyed. The pearl would have disappeared forever, and Robert Sinclair would have gotten away with the greatest act of revenge he'd ever attempted, except that he didn't, because we were there. Yes, because we were there. Tuppence reached across the table and took his hand. I wonder what he saw when he looked at Eleanor. At the end, I mean. I wonder if he realized that the revenge he'd waited 20 years to achieve had become less important than the life he'd actually built. Perhaps, Tommy said. Or perhaps he never realized it at all. Perhaps he simply ran out of time. The waitress brought fresh tea, and they ordered another round of cakes. The afternoon stretched before them with the sort of leisurely quality that suggested neither of them was in any particular hurry to leave. Mrs. Hartington sent me a note this morning, Tuppence said, withdrawing a letter from her handbag. She's decided to leave London. She's going to spend the winter in the south of France. She said she wants to remember who she is, away from all the ghosts of the past. A sensible decision, Tommy observed. She also mentioned, Tuppence continued, that she'd heard from the hospital. Gertrude Ashcroft regained consciousness yesterday. She's not expected to fully recover. Her injuries were quite severe. But the doctors think she'll survive. They're planning to charge her with conspiracy to commit fraud and insurance fraud from her time in Delhi. Apparently, they've been waiting for a case that's strong for quite some time. Justice, Tommy said, works in mysterious and often tardy ways. She asked us something else, Tuppence said, returning the letter to her bag. She asked whether we would consider undertaking another investigation. There's a matter involving some missing jewellery in Rome, and she has a friend who would be most grateful for our assistance. Tommy smiled, that slow, warm smile that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. What did you tell her? I told her, Tuppence said, that we would consider it, on the condition that Rome includes proper Italian coffee and Italian ice cream, both of which I intend to sample extensively. A perfectly reasonable condition, Tommy agreed, and one I'm certain any reasonable person would accept. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and London, as it always did, hurried on with its own concerns, unaware that in a small cafe in Mayfair, two people had just set in motion the events that would lead them toward their next adventure. But that, as they say, is another story. The pink pearl had been recovered. The guilty party had received a sort of justice, though perhaps not the sort that would have satisfied Eleanor had Robert Sinclair lived. The scheme had been thwarted, the conspirators exposed, and the truth, however unwelcome, had finally emerged into the light. And Tommy and Tuppence, having completed their work with their usual mixture of logic, intuition, and that particular magic that comes from knowing each other better than they knew themselves, settled back into their chairs, ordered another round of tea, and prepared to rest, because rest, they had learned over the years, was perhaps the greatest luxury of all, and it never ever lasted very long.